Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Sara Shaarawi's play Niqabi Ninja, which I'm reading out of Contemporary Plays by African Women from Methuen Drama. This is a really, really cool play. It is a play fueled by righteous anger, and it is a play that... So there's this interesting bit in here that connects to something that Shaarawi says in the critical introduction in this book, in this collection. So there's two characters in the play. There's Hana and there's the Niqabi Ninja. They're essentially alter egos. They're in a somewhat unclear existential relationship, right? Hana is she's a graphic novelist, comics author, right? And she's writing this character of the Niqabi Ninja, but the Niqabi Ninja is also sort of her alter ego. And it's a sort of open question how much direct overlap there is between their identities versus how much the Niqabi Ninja is created as a sort of alternative to the powerlessness that Hana feels throughout much of this play and much of her life as a woman within patriarchal societies in Egypt and in London. So there's this bit where she has been in a cab, and she has this moment of terror that this cab driver is going to begin masturbating with her in the cab. And it turns out that he doesn't, but she has that anxiety because she knows that is a very real possibility. And so the Niqabi Ninja says, you should have made him masturbate in the comic book, the graphic novel, rather than in real life. Just to be clear. The first time I read that line, I was like, wait, what? And then I sort of realized in the comic book. So, you should have made him masturbate. Hana says, but that's not what happened. Niqabi Ninja says, who cares what actually happened? That was the scene, and that was the moment where she should have grabbed that pencil, and Hana cuts her off and says, I want to tell the truth. Niqabi Ninja says, it's a fucking comic. No one cares about the truth. Hana says, I do. And so one of the things that Shaarawi says in the critical introduction here is, people often ask me if this piece is autobiographical, and my answer is always that it's fictional, but that every experience expressed in the play is true. Hana doesn't represent me, but she is a dedication to every single woman I grew up with, every single woman who shared a story or called me in tears, every woman to whom I turned, every woman at those demonstrations, every woman who spoke out, and every woman who didn't. So what this is getting at, and I think this is a really sort of important framework with something like this play, with its central concern on the incredible prevalence of sexual violence within patriarchal societies, is what Tim O'Brien... Other people have this idea too, but the first place I encountered it was in Tim O'Brien's The Things That Carried. The idea of story truth, right? That the experiences that Hana and the Niqabi Ninja talk about, who put into this book, to put into this comic book, this graphic novel, are not necessarily Hana's experiences, and they definitely are not necessarily Shaarawi's experiences. But they are nonetheless true, right? They are someone's experiences, the experience that someone has had or could have had in the world. And so they reflect a profound truth. And this is part of what fiction, in not the sense of sort of prose, novels, short stories, whatever it is, but in the sense of a constructed story that exists as a piece of art. This is one of the things that fiction can help us to explore about the world, is that we are not sort of limited to this is the literal facts of what happened in a way that you might report it in court or something like this. That art allows us to be illustrative of these kinds of experiences. And I will say this. I know a number of women especially, but I know a number of women, LGBT people. I know men who are victims of sexual assault and sexual violence to one degree or another, in some cases quite severely. And I say that fully being aware that that is who I, as a straight man, know have had those experiences. And I guarantee you, I know many, 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 many more people who would not, regardless of how supportive, how much of an ally I attempt to be in my life. I guarantee you, I know many, many, many more people who would not feel comfortable sharing with me that they have had those experiences. And so this is one thing that I, as someone coming out of a Western context, coming out as a white/Jewish man from the United States, want to be very clear about. Shaarawi sets the majority of the action of this play in Cairo, and some of the most graphic and violent sexual violence that occurs in this play, gang rapes in Tahrir Square, for instance, are definitely set in Egypt. This is in no sense a condemnation of patriarchal Middle Eastern, North African, or Islamic countries to the exclusion of Western patriarchal violence. I think that's an incredibly important thing to be 100% clear about. So what we get over the course of the play is, so we get a number of things, one of which is this sort of progressive experience of this character that Hana is creating in this graphic novel, starting from age 12, where she goes out with her mother and is forced to buy her first bra, and immediately starts experiencing catcalls at age 12. And then there's sort of these progressive timelines of sexually explicit catcalling, of being groped against her will, etc., in both Cairo and in London. So again, this is not Egypt is bad, but the progressive, liberated Western world is good. No, we don't have that. Whatever. So we have that sort of progression of increasing sexual violence until, again, we have these anti-authoritarian protests in Tahrir Square, which devolve into mass gang rapes of women. And the Niqabi Ninja, the idea or the experience or the alter ego of the Niqabi Ninja sort of evolves out of that experience of violence, or that context of mass violence against women and continual low-level to sometimes high-level sexual violence against women. The Niqabi Ninja is essentially I think this is Batman's term, but basically a dark avenger, right? The Niqabi Ninja is someone who, in response to the pervasive nature of sexual violence, targets men, preferably men who have participated in sexual violence, sexual harassment, etc., etc., because the Niqabi Ninja also sort of starts from the assumption that all men are guilty of this to greater or lesser degrees. There's a certain sense in which every man is potentially guilty and potentially open to this retribution. So this is sort of the duality of this character or the characters. Again, the sort of overlap between them, the identification between Hana and the Niqabi Ninja is not 100% clear. It's a good ambivalence. But the other thing that I find really, really interesting is this sort of question of how this character relates to Egyptian identity. Because there is a point where Hana's boyfriend makes this sort of speech about the importance of going to Tahrir Square, which was a major site of anti-British protest in the early 1900s, 1919, for instance, when Egypt was breaking away from Britain. And he has this sort of utopic vision that the people will come together across identity lines of gender, of religion, etc., etc. And so he does not experience the protests in Tahrir Square in the way that Hana does. And so that's really, really important. So there's that element, that connection to Egyptian history, but Hana actually starts us out with a connection to Egyptian mythology. So the opening of the play, which I think is absolutely a brilliant one, Hana, there's Hana and the Niqabi Ninja, both looking out over the Cairo skyline. Hana says, Egypt, 2400 BCE. A goddess stands looking over the kingdom of Heliopolis. Her name is Isis. She and her husband Osiris had protected Egypt for thousands of years. But one day Osiris is killed by his brother Set, and his body is chopped up and scattered across the lands he was supposed to be protecting. Isis cried. Her tears caused the Nile to overflow. She cried and cried until there were no more tears left. Set had underestimated her power. What Set doesn't know is that once the tears end, Isis would rise as the hero of this tale. The Niqabi Ninja gives us the sort of preview of the speech we're getting at the end. Every night I will hunt one of you down. Every night I will walk through the streets. I'll take a mental picture of every piece of shit who dares to comment on my clothes, my breasts, my ass, my eyes, My mouth, my legs, my cunt. I will choose just one of you lucky bastards. I will rip you apart, and your screams will not be heard. I will make sure you pay for what you've done. And then Hana says, because Isis will find every single piece of her mutilated husband and she will put him back together. She will fix him. She will fix everything. And I think this is really, really cool. Because, so first off, I love adaptations of myth. That's my thing as a scholar primarily. That is what I work on. So I love that aspect of it. I think this is a really interesting one because the Isis, Osiris, Set, and Horus myth often doesn't center on Isis, even though she really is a driving force. It often centers on Horus, the son of Isis and Osiris, who takes revenge for his father by fighting Set and defeating him. But it is Isis who collects back up the scattered pieces of Osiris's body and reconstructs them, turns him into a god of the underworld, which for the Egyptians was not a bad thing at all, right? He was connected to the movement from this life to the afterlife, which was very central to ancient Egyptian culture. But this idea, she will fix him, she will fix everything, I think is really interesting because to the extent that the Niqabi Ninja is aligned with but contrasted with the story of Isis, the Niqabi Ninja, of course, is not trying to fix men, but she is trying to fix everything, in a sense, right? She is taking that generative energy of the Isis myth and turning it. Rather than Isis being responsible for reconstructing her husband's destroyed body, the Niqabi Ninja is charged with reconstructing an Egypt or a world that is safe for women, in which sexual violence is punished in a way that often in this world, unfortunately, it is not. And actually, strikingly enough, as I say that, in my country, the United States, unfortunately, because my country is incredibly dumb and terrible, we right now are having a big debate about whether or not our president has raped children, and whether or not that's something that should be public knowledge. So, yeah, I mean, this is a pervasive thing. But at the end of this play, Shaarawi returns to this story of Isis, and we have this contrast, right? This contrast with Isis, spelled out directly. Hana says, once there was a goddess. She had no name and no purpose, until one day her world was ripped apart and torn to pieces. She doesn't know that happened. I think that should be she doesn't know what happened or why, rather than, I think there's a typo there. She cried, but it made no difference. She was not Isis. She could not flood the Nile or revive the dead. Her story is a different one. And yeah, again, I think this is a really, really, really excellent use of adaptation as such, right? Of turning this story in which the generative energy of Isis is directed toward reconstituting her husband's body. Here that gets turned, it gets shifted toward regenerating a world in which women like Hana can safely exist in public spaces.